So at the at the same time that many of our rights to live are being taken away from us. Um, at the same time that that is happening, many of our lives are being taken from us as well. In grocery stores and shopping centers and schools and places that in order to live, one has to be able to go to. And in spite of the fact that in 2020, the year 2020, gun violence was the leading cause of death for children in the United States and had exceeded and surpassed the number of deaths caused by car accident for the first time, which had formerly been the leading cause of death for children in the United States. No significant national gun restriction bill has been put forward and passed by any legislature. And although that New York State has certain laws restricting the possession of certain types of gun, because there's no real means of monitoring and creating a system in which these types of guns or other guns purchased in the state of New York can be secured against entry into the state lines. There's no there's no means for any single state in the United States to protect its residents from gun violence caused either with weapons purchased outside of that state and in an area that doesn't ban these assault type rifles, or from protecting citizens within that state from gun violence caused by ordinary weapons, ordinary guns that don't fall under these protective restrictions in that state. And I was thinking recently about the Claude McKay poem, the sonnet, "If We Must Die," and what I had done with that sonnet as a way of talking about death in the United States under the conditions of racial prejudice, systemic injustice, the rise of fascism, failure on the part of what can't in any way be called progressive part of the U.S. government any longer. The politics have shifted so far to the insanity of the far right that the so-called moderates in the government are more focused on demonstrating symbolic gestures for public display than they are on accomplishing accomplishing anything to save our lives, save our rights, and preserve our Constitution. And I was thinking about, my performance of that sonnet, and how in recalling it and remembering it, I remember phrases and how fractured and broken it became. And I wanted to write or read something for the victims of the Buffalo grocery store shooting. And this moment, but I realized that I would have this difficulty of speaking through the pain of our moment here, and not just this moment, but this inception of what feels like every day feels like the growth of greater and greater threat, to life and to freedom and to health and to opportunity and to preservation of natural resources and so I thought that I would I knew that I would have this difficulty getting through the words, and So I thought that rather than reading a sonnet or another poem, as it might become reorganized around a moment, that I would, look at this article in the Washington Post and attempt to read, sections of it, and that would be some kind of an expression of this moment. And so what follows is that. And its title is National: What We Know About the Victims of the Buffalo Grocery Store Shooting. Two blocks of white light, rounded square corners, circles of variously colored light in the soft focus. Red, blue, yellow, white, brown. A length of or curve arc of white against a grayish brown inverted C. Sections of out of focus, blue-black. These are the soft focus that describe a police car parked on the other side of a road. Purple flowers against the bark of a tree. The sky in the background, above the soft focus building, unidentifiable, is so indescribably blue that it doesn't appear to be part of the reality of the material world and could easily belong to some kind of abstract depiction. Either an ad, a commercial, a cartoon, or a section of a field painting in a museum. The grain of the tree is hard to identify, but it's most certainly deciduous. Purple flowers, tiny bunches clustered together, as if seeking safety and security in their own community and embracing the deep ridges of the bark of the deciduous tree, as if further seeking the security of a larger relative. In the foreground, another cluster of purple flowers has fallen over still further and failed to reach out to the bark of the tree. It's either contained within a glass the glass of which houses a Ziploc plastic bag in which the stem of the flower is situated, or the Ziploc plastic bag imitates the shape and form of a glass fallen over. It's either dawn or evening, difficult to say. There are golden yellow glass jars next to the Ziploc bag in the foreground, situated in the tall grass that hasn't been mowed. In at least one of these, there is a candle whose flame is reflected in the jar that holds it, so that one sees the multiplication of the flame as it rises, receiving the air, heating the glass, lending its light to the scene. Coloring the flowers, the surface of the Ziploc bag. Sharing its golden light with the vase holding another set of flowers beside it. In the image, it is precisely at the center of the vertical line that describes the lights which form the blurred image of the police car. The jar that holds the candle is not entirely visible in the image presented in the photograph. At the bottom of the photograph, the candle itself, the wax of the candle, which provides the material out of which the flame grows, ends at the edge, the border of the representation. The glass jar at the top, the mouth, from which the flame receives the oxygen that it requires, to live, to light, to shine, to reveal, to be, appears to be ridged, to have grooves, appears to be the type of jar that once held some substance, whether that was peanut butter, jam, or jelly, or relish. Whether it was a jar for homemade pickling, a canning jar, whether it had held pickles or jam someone's grandmother or mother had made. And stored either in a root cellar or in a kitchen cabinet. The image doesn't say. The image doesn't say whether the flowers had been grown in a garden or purchased in a shop where one would go to acquire the things that one requires to live, to eat, to be, to love. And the way that the flowers cling to the bark of the tree like a child clinging to her mother's dress, his mother's dress, their mother's dress, our mother's dress, your mother's dress, or skirt, or pants, clinging for security. Seems to speak of the anxiety, the fear now of going to such stores in Buffalo grocery stores in which shootings occur, described by such images. Described by such candles. Described by such glasses. Described by such Ziploc bags. Described by such trees. Described by such colors of light. Described by such surreally blue skies. What we know about the victims of the Buffalo grocery store shooting. We know a small vigil is set up across the street from Top's supermarket We know the mass murder of African American citizens occurred on a Saturday. We know that Saturday's murders were motivated by racial hatred. We know that racial hatred as a fire fanned stoked and fed by politicians and media. We know that already by Sunday, Mr. Murdoch's team of hate-mongering hate-filled fascist media pundits would be presenting their cases on Fox News that such murders have nothing to do with race, systemic injustice, and the need for gun control in the United States. We know that it was a Saturday. We know that there were deaths. We know there is a small vigil set up across the street from Tops Supermarket. We know that if you wish to listen to the article, it will require 11 minutes of your time. We know a grandmother volunteered every weekend at her church's food pantry. We know an octogenarian was a devoted caregiver to her husband of 68 years. We know a retired police officer, an amateur inventor, tried to stop the shooter. We know he is no longer with us. We know his name was Aaron Salter. We know Aaron Salter was aware of the threat of violence in a racialized America. We know Aaron Salter feared such violence directed against himself, the members of his family, and the members of his community. We know Aaron Salter's fear of such violence had grown into a part of his life. We know that Aaron Salter feared that if he discussed the potentiality for such violence and death in the community in which he had worked, he had retired, he had continued to work, that he would be regarded as paranoid or deluded. We know that Aaron Salter discussed such anxieties. We know a retired police officer and amateur inventor attempted to stop the shooter. We know that, to say it this way, that these were some of the lives cut short in a blaze of hate-fueled violence in Buffalo on Saturday is not enough. We know that to say it in this way, these were some of the lives cut short in a blaze of hate-fueled violence in Buffalo on Saturday, is somehow wrong. We know to say it this way, these were some of the lives cut short in a blaze of hate-fueled violence in Buffalo on Saturday, somehow fails to express everything that we feel. These were some. We know these were some is not enough. We know these were are not the words we would choose. We know some. We know some is the wrong choice between the words were and of. We know of the lives is the wrong proximity to have to the cut short in a blaze. We know blaze is the wrong metaphor to contain the death. The deaths that we know occurred in Top Supermarket on a Saturday in Buffalo. We know the preposition of situated between the word blaze and hate. We know the dash in the adjectival modifier of violence. We know the situation of Buffalo on a map. We know that a Saturday is a day of worship for some. We know an attack does not always result in the deaths of so many people. We know that to count to the number 10 on one's hand requires the use of each of one's fingers. We know what a busy supermarket looks and sounds like. We know that when the supermarket is busy, one is required to spend more time waiting in line. We know that to be killed is not to return. We know that to be seriously injured is to spend time in hospital. We know the meaning of hate and we know the meaning of crime. We know the meaning of violence and we know the meaning of extremism. We know the meaning of terrorism and we know the meaning of charge. We know that 11 of 13 can be described as a fraction or a ratio. We know 11, the number, exceeds the amount of fingers that we have on our two hands. We know that 13 is the number that follows 12 and precedes 14. We know that in the context of the sentence, 11 of the people shot were black. We know within the context of the sentence, 11 of the 13 people shot were black. There is a definition of racism. We know in the sentence, 11 of the 13 people shot were black. There is a definition of hatred. We know in the sentence, 11 of the 13 people shot were black. There is a definition of violence. We know in the sentence 11 of the 13 people shot were black. There is a definition of motivation. We know in the sentence 11 of the 13 people shot were black. There is a definition of what it is to live in America today. We know the meaning of the word racist. We know the meaning of the word anti-Semitic. We know the meaning of the word white supremacist. We know the meaning of the word racist. We know the meaning of the word anti-Semitic. And we know the meaning of the word white supremacist. We know that the word belief or beliefs following these words troubles us. We know that the word beliefs doesn't want to sit well with the words racist, anti-Semitic, and white supremacist. We know that the word belief is uncomfortable in the sentence, the suspect, 18-year-old Peyton Gendron, is believed to have published a lengthy online document riddled with racist, anti-Semitic, and white supremacist beliefs. We know the first appearance of belief between the is and the to, between the is and the to have published, doesn't sit well. We know we want to know why and how. The belief situated between the is and the to have published that is intended to belong to our uncertainty can be the same verb situated after racist, anti-Semitic, and white supremacist beliefs. We are uncomfortable. We know that we are uncomfortable being situated in the same verb. We know the text detailed plans for the attack. And because we know the text detailed plans for the attack, we are confused by the use of the verb belief situated between the is and the to have. We know the expression a predominantly black neighborhood. We know the subjectivity involved in the expression a predominantly black neighborhood. We know the sterility of expressions such as a predominantly black neighborhood. We know the expression a predominantly black neighborhood can't possibly speak of a grandmother who volunteered every weekend at her church's food pantry. We know the distance created in the expression a predominantly black neighborhood can't describe an octogenarian who was a devoted caregiver to her husband of 68 years. We know the absence of pathos in an expression such as a predominantly black neighborhood can't possibly depict a retired police officer and amateur inventor who attempted to stop a shooter. We know there was an occurrence of a blaze of hate-fueled violence in Buffalo on Saturday. We know some of these lives were cut short. We know that the attack occurred at a busy supermarket. We know what a busy supermarket is. We know what a busy supermarket looks and sounds like. We know what it is to wait in line at a busy supermarket. We know the meanings of the word hate. We know the meanings of the word crime. We know the meaning of the word race. We know the meaning of the word race, and therefore we know the meaning of the word racially motivated. We know the meaning of the word violent, and therefore we know the meaning of the word violent extremism. We know there are ways of exploring possible domestic terrorism charges under certain conditions of violence. We know these conditions have to be met, shown, and proven before those charges can be raised. We know the meanings of the words racist, anti-Semitic, and white supremacist. We know the meaning of the word belief, and we know the word belief does not sit well twice as it appears in the sentence, the suspect, 18-year-old Peyton Gendron, is believed to have published a lengthy online document riddled with racist, anti Semitic, and white supremacist beliefs. We want the belief, the verb, the noun to be different somehow when they're used to describe the 18-year-old Peyton Gendron and when they're used to describe what by implication we are yet to know. We want our verb to be separate from his noun. We want his noun. We want his racist, anti Semitic, white supremacist noun to carry more condemnation than beliefs. We want our verb situated between is and to have published to carry more condemnation and surety of our experience of loss. We know that the sentence, the mass shooting is the latest in a painful litany of violence driven by hate and racism. We know the sentence, the mass shooting is the latest in a painful litany of violence driven by hate and racism. We know the sentence, the mass shooting is the latest in a painful litany of violence driven by hate and racism. There is an abstraction and failure on the part of nearly every one of the words chosen to express our indignation and pain and outrage. We know the noun phrase, the mass shooting, isn't quite right. We know the phrase, latest in a painful litany of violence, is inadequate. We know driven by hate and racism is too distant, too abstract. We know there were children, we know there were mothers, we know there were grandmothers, we know each of the murdered victims had a family. We know there are always painful litanies of violence driven by hate and racism. We know the litanies never end. We know the violence fails to stop. We know the politicians on the day after the violence condemn the violence and in the next breath promote American citizens' right to arm themselves with assault rifles. We know the flow of money from the NRA into the pockets of the Republicans. We know the failures of the Democratic senators to enact significant laws to save the lives of individuals in such communities. We know the tears that roll down the cheeks of those whose family members are murdered by acts of violence. We know the painful litany of violence We know the painful litany of violence. We know the painful litany of violence. We know violence driven by hate and racism. We know violence driven by hate, bigotry. We know violence driven by anti Semitism. We know violence driven by white supremacy. We know violence driven by inaction. We know violence driven by the failure on the part of those designated to secure our rights, to protect us from such violence. We know the violence of guns. We know the violence of rhetoric. We know the violence of inaction. We know the violence of indifference. We know the violence of denial. We know the violence of mesmerism. We know the violence of turning away. We know the violence of closing the door. We know the violence of the wall. We know the violence of the strikebreakers. We know the violence of the law. We know the violence of the cage. We know the violence of the chains. We know the violence of the silence. We know the violence of the turning away. We know the violence of the denial. We know the violence of the mask. And we know the violence of the confrontation. We know the painful litany of violence can be named. We know the painful litany of violence can be identified. We know of a black church in Charleston. We know of a synagogue in Pittsburgh. We know of a Walmart in El Paso. We know of a black church in Charleston. We know of a synagogue in Pittsburgh. We know of a Walmart in El Paso. We know of 2015. We know of 2018. We know of 2019. We know of 2020. We know of 2021. We know of 2022. And we know of what will be in 2023. We know of Buffalo and beyond. We know of family members. We know of victims. We know of the dead. We know that the dead are buried. We know that the dead never return. We know of the experience of loss. We know of the suffering of absence. We know of the enduring beyond. We know that such losses are both sudden and incomprehensibly cruel. We know of the losses of mothers, of fathers, of brothers and sisters. We know the color of our skin. We know the color of our mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters' skin. We know of the losses caused by the color of our mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters' skin. We know the hail of bullets. We know the grocery stores. What we know about the victims of the Buffalo grocery store shooting. Part 3. A purple carpet in a room that appears to be a foyer or waiting area, maybe a lounge, in what might be a church. And a woman dressed in a floral blouse with a necklace around her neck. And wearing a gray hat, her hands folded together. In front. An arrangement of flowers placed on the floor on a raised space over the first area of purple carpet. Some of the flowers white, others purple as well. Suggesting again perhaps the space of a church. A COVID mask wrapped around her wrist, presumably for the photo opportunity, for the shot to be placed as protection and insurance, safety once the photograph has been taken. What appears to be an open door, framing the area around her, behind her head and the top part of her shoulders, opening into a yellow room, but somehow suggesting a kind of rectangular or rectilinear halo behind her. Chairs. Draped with shawls and what might be handbags. A display case or perhaps podium. A bench. A smile. A direct address. At the camera. A familiarity with whomever is taking the picture. What we know about the victims of the Buffalo grocery store shooting. We know Pearl Young was 77 years old. We know Pearl Young took a photo in a room with a purple carpet, wearing a floral blouse. And a gray hat. We know the woman in the undated photograph is named Pearl Young. And when she was murdered in Buffalo, at the Top supermarket, she was 77 years old. We know for years Young spent every Saturday morning in the same way. We know Pearl Young volunteered at a food pantry run by her church. We know Pearl Young helped prepare and hand out boxes of food from the Good Samaritan Church of God in Christ at an outpost in a Buffalo park. We know Pearl Young relished interacting with her community. We know Pearl Young viewed volunteering as part of her religious duty. We know Pearl Young was a mother. We know Pearl Young's son, Damon Young, is 48 years old. We know Pearl Young was born in Fayette, Alabama. We know Pearl Young spent much of her life, in Buffalo. We know Pearl Young was full of joy. We know Pearl Young loved life. We know Pearl Young loved her church. We know Pearl Young loved children. We know Pearl Young was a proud grandmother to 8. We know Pearl Young was a substitute high school teacher. We know that at 77 years old, Pearl Young was still working. We know at 77 years old, Pearl Young was still working as a high school substitute teacher. We know Pearl Young had a fondness for ambrosia salad. We know that Pearl Young and her son Damon Young prepared and ate together ambrosia salad. We know that Pearl Young was diabetic. We know that Pearl Young was a longtime fan of the soap opera, The Young and the Restless. We know that Damon Young often had to wait for his mother, Pearl Young, when she was watching the soap opera, The Young and the Restless, before picking her up and taking her out for errands. We know the day of the shooting, Pearl Young went out to breakfast. We know the day of the shooting, where Pearl Young went afterwards to shop. We know that Damon Young had planned on picking his mother up from the Tops Friendly Market on Saturday after she'd gone out to breakfast. We know that because Damon Young had been planning on picking his mother up after she shopped on Saturday, that they had been in contact with one another by phone. We know that Pearl Young at some point stopped responding to Damon Young by phone. We know that at some point Damon Young called his mother Pearl Young, and she failed to respond. We know that Damon Young made a phone call on Saturday and was unable to reach his mother. We know that after failing to reach his mother in the phone call that he made on that Saturday, his phone began buzzing. We know that Damon Young on that Saturday received news alerts. We know those news alerts involved information regarding the terrorism at the store. We know that Damon Young learned that some people had been wounded in addition to those who were killed. We know that Damon Young held out hope that his mother had only been wounded. We know that Damon Young held out hope that his mother had only been wounded by hate. We know that Damon Young held out hope that his mother had only been wounded by shooting. We know that Damon Young held out hope that his mother had only been wounded by crime. We know that Damon Young held out hope that his mother had only been wounded by violence. We know that Damon Young held out hope that his mother had only been wounded by extremism. We know that Damon Young held out hope that his mother had only been wounded. We know that Damon Young held out hope. We know the meaning of the expression full of joy. We know the meaning of the expression children to whom she was a proud grandmother. We know the number 8 occurs just after the number 7 and just before the number 9. We know the ingredients for ambrosia salad. We know that The Young and the Restless is a soap opera. We know the condition of the diabetic, and we know that the care that the condition of diabetes requires. We know the concern that a child of a diabetic parent takes and has regarding her health. We know of the condition of waiting. We know how to enter a phone number into the keyboard provided for a cell phone. We know the sounds to expect from a response. We know that Damon Young learned that his mother had been fatally shot at Top's grocery store on a Saturday. We know that after learning his mother had been fatally shot at a Top's grocery store on Saturday, he wanted to leave. We know that after he learned that his mother had been fatally shot at a Top's grocery store on a Saturday, he cried on his way to his sister's house. We know that Saturday occurs between a Friday and a Sunday. We know that in some religions it is considered a holy day and a day of worship. We know what it is to want to leave somewhere where one does not want to be. We know what it is to want to leave somewhere where someone is, where someone does not want to be. We know what it is to cry. And we know what it is to cry on one's way. And we know what it is to cry on one's way to somewhere. And we know what it is to cry on one's way away from somewhere. We know that Damon Young spent Sunday talking to detectives. And we know what it is to want to leave somewhere where we don't want to be. We know Damon Young spent Sunday talking to detectives. And we know what it is to cry on one's way to somewhere. We know Damon Young spent Sunday talking to detectives, and we know what it is to cry on one's way away from somewhere. We know funeral plans were made for Pearl Young. And we know what it is to learn of the death of one's mother. We know funeral plans were made. And we know what it is to learn of the death of one's mother. We know Damon Young was up until 3 a.m. on Sunday crying and sifting through his memories. And we know what it is to be up until 3 a.m. on a Sunday, crying and sifting through memories.